The Tribal Data Toolbox Exercise 7 is entering the chain of custody records for PM 2.5 filters. And as this diagram illustrates, it's very important and necessary that you document your chain of custody in order to verify that the requirements for the filters were met, thereby validating your data. So let's look at the exercise, and it has the usual starting instruction to follow the SOP. So we want to make sure that we have that handy. And we can see that this is a long SOP, and we've already done the QC and maintenance checks. That's the information that we added from all those different checks of the samplers themselves. And now we're going to enter chain of custody data. We're going to start off with the tiered filter receipt. And what that means is when you get a group of unexposed filters from the weighing lab, even before you place them in the field or at some point, you need to enter into the toolbox the information on when they were weighed by the laboratory and what samplers they're going into. So let's take a look at how we are going to do that. So clicking on Filter Method Monitoring in your toolbox. Now remember, in our last exercise we did this, the QC and maintenance check data. Now we're going to enter chain of custody for unexposed tiered filters to start with. So we click on that, and I have already done this exercise, and always you want to make sure to look down here in the lower left corner. This form automatically opens to a new blank form, and it suggests a date. And in order to look and see the information that I've already entered, you can click on the back arrow or the back rewind to get to the first record, and you can see that it has this form has the filter ID, the chain of custody form ID, the tiered filter receipt date, that's when you got it from the weighing laboratory, who received it in your office, what weighing lab you used, and then what's very important is the tare weighing date, and then when it must be used by. And that's important to validate your data because PM 2.5 is so volatile that you really need to reweigh the filter if it hasn't been exposed, because the filter can actually change in terms of the amount of moisture it takes up, etc. So there's a lot of requirements for PM 2.5 filters. So looking at the exercise, it says to look at the chain of custody documents, and that every page of the document contains a chain of custody sheet for a different filter, and each sheet is separated into parts. So taking a look at what this is, you can see that this is chain of custody form ID, and some laboratories have a form ID. Some laboratories use different ways of identifying these forms. What's the key is the filter ID. That ties everything together in your toolbox. So the filter ID is extremely important. This first part is what the laboratory is going to enter. So you will get your unexposed filters with this first part looking something like this, at least with this data in it, saying when the lab weighed the filter. Then there's the receipt at your office, and there may be, again, the blanks may be in a different order, but there should be some record about when you received it at your office, who received it, and just checking to make sure that the shipment didn't have giant holes through the box, etc. Then the second part is when it is placed into the field, and this obviously goes into what sampler it goes into and when it was set to run. Then part 3 is when you ship it back to the weighing laboratory, when you ship it. And then the final part is when the weighing laboratory weighs it again after they've received it, and then ultimately are able to weigh and get the difference, and then you take that weight divided by the volume of air that you pump through the filter to calculate the PM 2.5 concentration in the air. So this is a chain of custody form ID for this filter ID. And you can see if you scroll through this document that has this chain of custody information on it, you've got filter ID 4294511, and then 4294512, etc. Every page has a different filter ID and all of the information that you need to enter into the toolbox to track the chain of custody and ultimately validate this data. So we've got 12 pages with 12 different filters and the information that you need to enter in the toolbox. So looking at the exercise, it specifies that we are supposed to, probably during routine operations, each part of the chain of custody would be filled out at a different time, and the best way to handle data is to enter it as soon as possible. So for example, after you receive the tiered filters from the lab, you could go ahead and enter this information, tiered filter receipt, into the toolbox. Then you would place them in the field and then go back into the toolbox and enter the next part. But let's just say, for purposes of this exercise, that you're going to enter all of this information at the same time. And this kind of thing is going to happen to you quite frequently, where you don't get to do your data entry as timely as it would be ideal to do. So what the exercise says is enter all of the tiered filter receipt, the part 1 information, for all 12 filters, then move on to the next part. So looking at how the chain of custody works, that we're going to enter all this information for the weighing laboratory, and that includes the filter ID, and here, and you can see this is the only field with the red border. It's extremely important that this filter ID be entered correctly, and then the yellow information is mandatory and the white is optional. So we've got this information from section A, and you enter all this information for this one filter, just this part. Then you go to the top of the next page, and now you've got the next filter. So when you enter information for one filter, let's just show how this is done. So at the very beginning, we've got 4294511 for filter ID. And here, we've got 4294511, and I entered it. The chain of custody form ID is here. The tiered filter receipt date, and we've got the tier weight date. That's when it was actually weighed, and that's here. The tier weighing date, the 3rd of August 2006. Information that is optional is how it was shipped from the lab, but you can see all of that information should be in here because this chain of custody is a very important record. So we've entered this information here. Now what do we do? Well, we know that we're going to the next record because we're going to change filter IDs. We're going to go to the top of the next page, and we're going to enter information for this filter ID. So how I do that in the toolbox is I just go to the next record here by clicking the next button, and I go to what now will become record 2, and you can see I've got filter ID 4294512, and I enter this information pertaining to filter ID 4294512, and I go through, and the top of the next page, section A, is filter ID ending in 13. So I click the next button down here, and I enter this information 4294513, and I enter that information, and I continue on until I've entered all the information for 12 filters, and you can see I've entered all of that information here in this toolbox, and then I'm finished with this, just the first part of this, where I've entered the information from section A, the weighing laboratory, before it goes into the field. One of the tricks to entering information that is the same from the previous records is described right here in the exercise. If you want to copy the data from the same field, you hold down the control key and press the apostrophe key. And what I mean from that, let's just say, so we've entered 12 records here, and let's just say that I need to enter more, and I press the next button to go to the next record. Let's just say that I wanted to use the same chain of custody form ID that was in the previous record. So I don't want to go through and type in all that long number again, and I'm going to have to do it multiple times. So I go to the new blank record, hold down the control key and apostrophe, and it copies what was in the previous record into the field I'm in. And that can be useful in a situation like this when you've got lots of data entry to do. So just to show you something that happens all the time in the toolbox when you're experimenting with different sorts of things, is I just demonstrated that how to use the control and apostrophe to copy the information for a field from the previous record into the current record. And let's just say, okay, well, I was just fooling around with that. I don't want to actually save this record. So I click Exit Form, and then what pops up is this: index or primary key cannot contain a null value. And what that's telling me is, look, you tried to enter some information in here, so we're going to try to save this, but you did not enter the filter ID, which is very, very important, and we're not even going to allow you to save this. We say, okay, I don't want to save this. And then it says, you can't save this record at this time. Would you like to close the database object anyway? Just say yes, and that means you're not going to save this, which is good because we were just fooling around looking at how that control apostrophe shortcut worked. So yes, we want to close it, and we are not going to save this record. So we've entered the chain of custody information from Part A from the weighing laboratory. Now that we've done that, we need to go on into finish the exercise, and we see that there are more parts to the exercise because there's a lot more to the chain of custody. So what do we do after we've entered all this information from the top part, the chain of custody data from the unexposed tiered filters? We've entered all 12 filters, that information from the top portion. Well, then we have to go back to the first page and now enter all the rest of the information into these subsequent buttons. So now we're going to enter the field placement data from the chain of custody. So this is when you actually place the filter into a sampler. You have to tell the toolbox what sampler it went into, and that way it can associate all of that maintenance and QC records that you have kept in the toolbox so that your chain of custody chain is effective and that you can properly validate your data. So looking down in the toolbox, the field placement data from the chain of custody, that's going to be this information here. When did it go into the sampler? What site is it at? What's the sampler serial number? And what type of filter it is. FB is field blank. RO is routine. So let's click on this next button, field placement data from the chain of custody. And we see that we have already, there are no filters eligible for field placement data entry. So we say, okay, exit form. So what do I do if I encounter an error like that? All of the possible errors that you could encounter are described in the SOP. So looking through this SOP, before I call Melinda or Angelique, or really you could call us and we would talk you through it just fine, but just totally trying to work through this on your own, you will find the answers to these questions in the SOP. So a lot of times we've put these in red boxes. So if you receive a message box in a blank form saying there are not any filters in the toolbox, oh, that's what we just saw. That's because in this particular toolbox, I have already entered all of the information in the toolbox for which samplers these filters have been placed into, and that's exactly what this error message shows here. In that case, so for example, if you click here and it's saying that we've already assigned all the filters to a sampler. I can click OK, and then I can click Show All Data. And that shows me, oh, I've already entered this Part 2 field information. Let's just assume that I didn't realize that I started doing this and I stopped this exercise halfway through it. That's how you see if you've already entered all the information. If you click Show All Data here, and then you can see records 1 of 12. And now let's take a look at what I entered. So looking at the chain of custody sheet, so we are at the very first filter that ends in 11. Now we're going to enter the field information portion here. So this is a field blank. We put that filter type in there, the date, the sampler ID. Now we've done with 4294511. Now we're going to scroll down to the next page, and we're going to do the same for 4294512. I'm not going to close this form. I'm just going to click this next button here. And I can see if I click to go to the last record, I've entered all this information, and all of this information is from the second part here pertaining to the field. So basically what sampler did it go into, this filter go into, and what was the date, and what was the filter type. So we've done that portion all the way through to filter 4522. So you can see that we're here in step 2, and it's telling us to, when you've finished entering the data from part 1, click the exit form button or the lower X in the upper right corner of your toolbox form to exit that form, then move down this list of vertical buttons. So once we've done that, then let's just say, looking at this chain of custody, what happens then? So after it was placed into the sampler, then it was set up to run, we assume, and then you go back to the field, you get the filter out of the sampler, and now you've got to ship it to the weighing lab, and that has to be recorded in your chain of custody form on paper, and then that data entered into the toolbox. So that's this next button down the form, enter shipping data from the chain of custody. So I'm going to click on that, and it's going to tell me the same thing. There are no filters eligible for shipment data entry. After clicking the OK button on this message, click the Show All Data button to view or edit previously entered data. Show all data. Okay, so you could see that I've already entered this information here because this is pulling up record 1 of 12. So I know that there's 12 records entered with different filter IDs here, and now in this particular form the filter ID shows up. So you have to make sure you're really entering or editing the information pertaining to your particular filter from the chain of custody part 3 here about when it was shipped, if there was an air bill number, who shipped it, and what laboratory it was sent to. So looking at this data here, you could see that from this part 3 we have entered this. So we've got all these different filter IDs, and now in the toolbox is what date they were sent back to the weighing laboratory, who sent them, etc. Now what will happen next is the lab will get the filters, they'll weigh them, and then they will hopefully soon email you a report, and hopefully in a nice Excel spreadsheet that you can import into the toolbox, send you the information for the gross weight and the tare weight and the difference, which will be some minuscule number, and then you take that difference in terms of mass, so some microgram number, and then you divide by the volume of air that was sucked through that filter during the 24 hours when you set it up to sample. So after you've entered this information for all 12 of the pages down to filter ID 4294522, then you can exit this form, and you are done with this exercise.